Before the first light ever touched those frozen ridgelines in Korea, before a single command crackled through a radio, before history had time to decide what would be remembered and what would be forgotten, there was a moment when ordinary American soldiers were pushed beyond the limits of endurance, beyond strategy, beyond survival itself. A moment when the outcome no longer depended on numbers or position or even logic, but on something far more difficult to measure. Because on that night, in April of 1953, on a hill most people have never heard of, American soldiers proved something that still echoes through history. When pushed to the edge, they don't break. They redefine what it means to stand and fight. They called it the meat grinder, not as a figure of speech, but as a warning, because that's exactly what it was. In the darkness, wave after wave of enemy forces surged uphill, thousands against hundreds, relentless, disciplined, and willing to absorb staggering losses to take that ground. And at the top of that hill stood just over 250 American soldiers, isolated, running low on ammunition, cut off from immediate reinforcement. Every rational calculation pointed to the same conclusion: that position would fall, and those men would be overrun. But sometimes, history is shaped by men who refuse to accept what's supposed to happen next. By 1953, the Korean War had settled into a brutal stalemate. Gone were the sweeping advances and rapid offensives. In their place was a grinding, unforgiving reality, where every inch of ground was fought for, held, and contested as if it carried the weight of the entire war. Porkchop Hill, at a glance, didn't look like much, just a jagged rise of rock and dirt, but it overlooked key supply routes below. To the Americans, holding it meant stability, control, and leverage. To the Chinese, taking it meant momentum, advantage, and bargaining power in the negotiations that everyone knew were coming. And so that unremarkable hill became the center of a fight neither side could afford to lose. On that hill were young men who had barely left home, and veterans who had already seen too much. They dug into hardened ground, checked their weapons, wrote letters they hoped would arrive if they didn't, and waited. Because in that kind of war, you always knew the attack was coming. You just never knew exactly when. Among them were seasoned non-commissioned officers who understood the cost of hesitation, and young officers forced to carry decisions far heavier than their years. But above all, there was a shared understanding, unspoken but absolute. When it started, they would be on their own. And then it began. The night of April 16 didn't announce itself with chaos. It started cold, still, almost quiet enough to be deceptive. But in war, silence isn't peace, it's pressure building. When the first assault came, it didn't creep in. It crashed forward. Thousands of soldiers moving through the darkness, shouting, firing, closing the distance in a surge that turned the hillside into a collision of noise, light, and violence. The Americans held. They fought with everything they had, turning every position into a point of resistance. And somehow, the first wave broke. But there was no relief, only the certainty that more was coming. The second wave hit harder, larger, more determined. And this time, the cost began to show. Ammunition ran low, defensive lines tightened, wounded men couldn't be evacuated. The perimeter shrank, and with it, the margin for survival. There was no fallback position, no immediate reinforcement, no easy decision left to make. And still, no one pulled back. Not because they weren't afraid, but because they understood what was at stake. Not just the hill, but each other. By the time the third wave began, there were no illusions left. The position was critical, nearly unsustainable. Surrounded, outnumbered, and running out of options, the men on Porkchop Hill faced a reality that left no room for conventional thinking. And in that moment, when every standard solution had failed, one final decision emerged. It didn't need to. The only way to survive was to bring American artillery down on their own position. It went against instinct, against training, against everything a soldier is taught to avoid. It meant trusting that the calculations would be precise, that the fire would land close enough to stop the enemy, but not so close that it would wipe them out. It meant accepting that some of their own might not survive the decision. And yet, when the order was explained, there was no panic, no collapse, just understanding. Because everyone there knew exactly what the alternative was. And so the call went out. Fire on our position. What followed was something few who experienced it would ever fully put into words. At first, it was distant. A low, rolling thunder somewhere beyond the horizon. Then, the ground began to shake. And then the sky itself seemed to open. American artillery unleashed one of the most intense and precisely coordinated bombardments of the Korean War. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't desperation without control. It was calculated, disciplined, overwhelming force, delivered with a level of precision that turned the battlefield into something almost unreal. In just 24 hours, more than 77,000 artillery rounds were fired. For the men on that hill, it was both terrifying and life-saving. The earth never stopped moving. The air was constantly torn apart by shockwaves. Every second carried the possibility that the next impact would land too close. But for the attacking forces, it was devastating. Every advance was broken, every formation disrupted, every attempt to regain momentum collapsed under the sheer weight of firepower. The hill itself seemed to transform, from a defensive position into a force of destruction that fought back with relentless intensity. Later accounts describe it in ways that still feel impossible to fully grasp. Soldiers said it felt like the mountain was coming apart beneath them. Artillery crews worked until their bodies began to fail, rotating shifts to keep the guns firing without destroying the equipment itself. Some lost their hearing permanently, others lost all sense of time, because they knew exactly what was happening above them. They were keeping those men alive. And then, almost as suddenly as it began, it stopped. When the fire lifted and the silence returned, it carried something no one had expected just hours before. The hill was still in American hands. The assault had been repelled, the position held. Against overwhelming odds, against every numerical disadvantage, those men had endured. But victory, in a place like that, always comes at a cost. Of the 250 Americans on Porkchop Hill, the vast majority were killed or wounded. Only a small number walked away without injury. On the other side, the losses were staggering, numbers that reflected the sheer scale of what had taken place. And yet, just weeks later, an armistice would bring the war to a halt. And that hill, scarred, shattered, and nearly erased, remained under American control. Over time, Porkchop Hill never became as widely known as other battles. It didn't carry the same recognition as places like Normandy or Gettysburg. It faded, quietly, into the background of history. But for those who were there, and for those who understand what it means to stand your ground when everything says you can't, it was never forgotten. Because in the end, Porkchop Hill isn't just about terrain or tactics or numbers. It's about the moment when training meets courage, when fear meets decision, when ordinary men are placed in extraordinary circumstances and choose not to give in. It's about trust, about sacrifice, about holding the line, not because it's easy, not because it's guaranteed, but because it has to be done. And maybe that's why the steel rain still echoes, not just as the sound of artillery, but as a reminder that, when everything was on the line,